August 15th, 1987. Frank Mackenzie had the fastest draw in Hollywood. 3 generations of cowboys respected his name. That's exactly why he thought he could embarrass Charles Bronson in front of the entire Death Wish 3 crew. The cameras weren't rolling. 200 cast and crew members formed a circle in the studio lot. Frank called Bronson out for using stunt doubles. Bronson stepped forward, hand hovering over his prop Colt. 45. Whenever you're ready, kid, Bronson said. What happened in the next 0.12 seconds ended Frank's 30-year career. The studio executives held emergency meetings because of it. Security footage was confiscated, and for 30 years, when people talked about the fastest draw in Hollywood, they never mentioned Frank Mackenzie's name again. The day Lightning Mackenzie learned that legends aren't born from speed, he discovered that Charles Bronson was hiding something worth killing for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Frank's hand moved like lightning, the same draw that had made him a legend on 17 Western sets. His Colt cleared leather in what should have been an impossible 0.08 seconds, the muscle memory of 3 decades guiding every micro movement. But Charles Bronson's gun was already pointing at Frank's chest. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. 200 crew members stood frozen, coffee cups halfway to lips, scripts forgotten in trembling hands. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the studio lot, turning the mock gunfight into something that felt dangerously real. Bronson's eyes weren't those of an actor playing a role. They held the cold calculation of a man who'd stared death in the face and won. His weathered face remained stone still, but Frank caught something else flickering behind those famous blue eyes. Relief. As if Bronson had been expecting this moment, preparing for it. Jesus Christ, someone whispered from the crowd. Frank's arm trembled as he lowered his weapon, the prop gun suddenly feeling heavier than any real iron he'd ever carried. The mathematics were impossible. He'd practiced that draw 10,000 times. He could outdraw professional gunfighters at Old West shows, leave stunt coordinators speechless, make seasoned cowboys shake their heads in amazement. Nobody was faster than Lightning Mackenzie. Nobody except Charles Bronson had just proven that wrong in front of half of Hollywood. The crowd began to murmur, then buzz, then roar with nervous laughter and excited chatter. But Frank barely heard them. His eyes were locked on Bronson's face, studying the man who'd just destroyed his reputation with a single impossible moment. That's when he saw it, a thin line of sweat beading on Bronson's forehead despite the cooling evening air. The slight tremor in the actor's gun hand as he holstered his weapon. And something else, something that made Frank's stomach drop. Fear. Charles Bronson was afraid of him. Not of losing the contest. He'd already won that. He was afraid of what Frank might do next, what Frank might say. The way Bronson's eyes darted toward the crowd, then back to Frank, reminded him of a cornered animal calculating its escape routes. "Good draw, kid," Bronson said, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had intimidated screen villains for decades. But Frank caught the slight waver underneath. The careful control. Maybe stick to coordinating stunts from now on. The crowd erupted in laughter, the tension breaking like a snapped guitar string. Crew members began slapping Frank on the back, offering consolations and jokes about going up against a legend. But their words felt distant, muffled, as if Frank were underwater, because he was remembering last night. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Walking back to the production trailers after the wrap party, needing to grab his jacket from the stunt coordinator's office. The sound of urgent whispered voices from Bronson's trailer. A door slamming. A woman's silhouette hurrying away from the trailer park, her heels clicking rapidly across the asphalt. And then Bronson himself, standing in his trailer doorway, scanning the darkness with the same calculating look he'd just given Frank. The same fear, the same desperation of a man with everything to lose. Frank had thought nothing of it at the time. Hollywood was built on secrets, affairs, and midnight meetings. But now, watching Bronson work the crowd with practiced charm, deflecting questions about where he'd learned to draw so fast, Frank felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The confiscated security footage made sense now. The emergency meetings weren't about Frank's humiliation. They were about damage control. about protecting something much bigger than an actor's reputation. Frank Bronson appeared at his elbow, having worked his way through the dispersing crowd. Up close, the fear was even more obvious. "Hell of a draw you've got there. Been practicing long?" 30 years, Frank replied, studying the man's face. "What about you, Charlie? When did you get so fast?" Something flickered behind Bronson's eyes, a moment of naked panic before the mask slid back into place. "Natural talent, I guess. Listen, kid, you mind keeping this between us? The studio doesn't like when actors do their own stunt work. Insurance reasons, you understand." Frank understood perfectly. The fastest draw in Hollywood had just been beaten by an actor who shouldn't have been able to clear leather in under half a second. An actor who was sweating bullets despite the cooling air. An actor who was asking him to keep quiet about what had just happened in front of 200 witnesses. "Sure thing, Mr. Bronson," Frank said, his voice steady despite the questions multiplying in his mind. "Just between us." Bronson nodded, relief washing over his features. He clapped Frank on the shoulder with forced camaraderie, then walked away toward the production offices, his stride just a little too quick to be casual. Frank stood alone in the emptying lot, watching the man who just ended his career disappear into the maze of trailers and equipment trucks. The taste of humiliation was bitter in his mouth, but underneath it was something else, the metallic tang of fear, and the growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something much more dangerous than a simple contest of speed. Frank's hands shook as he drove the winding road toward his apartment in Burbank, the headlights of passing cars creating streaks of light across his windshield. The radio droned something about traffic on the 405, but the words felt meaningless. Everything felt meaningless, except the image burned into his retinas. Bronson's gun, already drawn, already aimed, already ending everything Frank had spent his life building. The apartment complex squatted between a laundromat and a Mexican restaurant, the kind of place where actors and stunt performers lived when they were between gigs or just starting out. Frank had been here 3 years now, ever since he'd saved enough from coordinating stunts on low-budget westerns to afford his own place. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom with thin walls and a view of the dumpster, but it was his. He climbed the external stairs to the second floor, his legs feeling heavy as concrete. The hallway smelled like cigarettes and cooking oil, familiar scents that usually felt like home. Tonight they made his stomach churn. The key stuck in the lock, the way it always did, and Frank had to jiggle it while pressing his shoulder against the door. Such a small, ordinary struggle. This morning it had been just another minor annoyance in his life. Now it felt like the universe mocking him. Inside, the apartment was exactly as he'd left it. The kitchen table covered with scripts he'd been studying for upcoming jobs, a half-eaten sandwich on a paper plate, his spare holsters hanging from a chair back like discarded dreams. The walls were covered with photographs from film sets. Frank demonstrating quick-draw techniques to wide-eyed actors, shaking hands with directors, laughing with fellow stunt coordinators. In every picture, he was smiling. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt like smiling. Frank walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at its contents without really seeing them. A carton of milk, some leftover Chinese takeout, a 6-pack of beer with 2 bottles missing, the mundane inventory of a life that had just been derailed. He grabbed a beer and twisted off the cap, the metal biting into his palm. The first sip was cold and bitter, matching his mood perfectly. The phone rang. Frank stared at it, knowing what the call would bring. Word traveled fast in Hollywood, faster when it involved humiliation. By tomorrow morning, everyone would know that Lightning Mackenzie had been outdrawn by Charles Bronson in front of half the industry. The offers would dry up. The phone would stop ringing. He let it go to his answering machine. "Frank, it's Tommy Chen." Tommy's voice filled the small kitchen, concerned and careful. Tommy was another stunt coordinator, one of the few Frank considered a real friend. "Listen, man, I heard what happened on set today. Don't let it get to you, okay? Bronson's been doing this for 20 years, probably picked up a few tricks along the way. Call me back when you get this." The machine clicked off, leaving Frank alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Ventura Boulevard. He walked to his bedroom and sat on the edge of the unmade bed, still holding his beer. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph, his parents standing in front of their ranch in Montana, his father wearing the same kind of holster Frank had carried today. His father had taught him to shoot when he was 12, starting with tin cans lined up on fence posts and progressing to quick draw competitions at county fairs. "Speed's important, son," his father had said, adjusting Frank's stance, "but accuracy's what keeps you alive. And knowing when not to draw at all, that's wisdom." Frank had never learned that last part. He'd been so eager to prove himself, to show everyone that Lightning Mackenzie was the fastest gun in Hollywood. The irony tasted worse than the beer. He thought about calling Sarah. She was a script supervisor he'd been seeing for 6 months. Someone who understood the crazy rhythms of film work and didn't mind when he disappeared for weeks on location shoots. She'd been at craft services today, probably saw the whole thing, probably already knew his career was over before he did. But what would he say to her? That he'd been beaten by an actor who shouldn't have been able to outdraw a mall security guard, let alone the fastest stunt performer in the business? That something was wrong with the whole situation? That Bronson's fear didn't make sense? That the speed was impossible? She'd think he was making excuses. Hell, maybe he was. Frank finished his beer and lay back on the bed, still fully clothed. The ceiling had a water stain shaped like Texas, something he'd noticed on his first night in the apartment. He'd told himself then that it was temporary, that he'd be moving to a better place once his career took off. Now he wondered if he'd be staring at that stain for the rest of his life. Outside his window, Los Angeles hummed with its usual restless energy, dreams being born and dying with equal frequency, fortunes made and lost between lunch meetings. Somewhere out there, Charles Bronson was probably sleeping peacefully, secure in his victory. But Frank couldn't shake the memory of that fear in Bronson's eyes, the desperate relief when Frank agreed to keep quiet, the way Bronson had walked away too fast, like a man fleeing a crime scene. Whatever had happened today, Frank was certain of one thing: it wasn't over. Frank stared at the Texas-shaped water stain until his eyes burned, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed them, he saw Bronson's gun materializing like magic, already aimed, already ending everything. The digital clock on his nightstand glowed 3:47 a.m. in accusatory red numbers. He was reaching for another beer when someone knocked on his door. 3 sharp raps, urgent but not frantic. Frank froze, bottle halfway to his lips. Nobody visited at 4 in the morning unless something was very wrong or very important. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's television murmuring in Spanish, the same late-night movie she watched when her arthritis kept her awake. The knocking came again, more insistent. Frank set down the beer and walked to the door, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet. The peephole showed a woman in shadow, her face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. Something about her posture, the way she held herself, tense and ready to run, reminded him of Bronson's fear. "Frank Mackenzie?" Her voice was low, controlled, with the faintest trace of a southern accent. Depends who's asking. Someone who was at craft services yesterday. Someone who saw what really happened. Frank's hand froze on the deadbolt. Through the peephole, he watched the woman glance over her shoulder, scanning the empty parking lot below. The gesture was quick, practiced, like someone accustomed to looking for threats. "I don't know what you're talking about." Charles Bronson's draw wasn't natural talent. She stepped closer to the door, and Frank caught a glimpse of dark hair under the cap, pale skin stretched tight with exhaustion. "And you're not the first person he's humiliated to keep his secrets safe." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He fumbled with the locks, his hands suddenly clumsy, and pulled the door open. The woman was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with sharp green eyes that had seen too much. She wore jeans and a faded jacket. Nothing remarkable except for the way she carried herself, like a person who'd learned to disappear when necessary. "Who are you?" "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a journalist." She glanced past him into the apartment, then back to his face. "May I come in? This isn't a conversation for hallways." Frank stepped aside, and she entered quickly, moving to the window first to check the parking lot before turning back to him. Everything about her movement suggested someone who'd learned caution the hard way. "You said I wasn't the first," Frank said, closing the door and engaging both locks. "What did you mean?" Elena reached into her jacket and Frank tensed, but she only withdrew a manila envelope, thick with papers. 3 years ago, there was a stunt performer named Danny Kowalski. Fastest draw on the East Coast, worked on every Western that filmed in New York. He challenged Bronson during the filming of Death Hunt. She handed him the envelope. Danny lost, just like you, in front of witnesses to a man who had no business outdrawing a professional. Within 6 months, Danny couldn't get work anywhere. Not just Hollywood, nowhere. He died in a car accident outside Reno 2 years ago. Frank's fingers felt numb as he opened the envelope. The first document was a police report, Danny Kowalski's name typed in stark black letters. Single vehicle accident, no witnesses, blood alcohol above the legal limit. But underneath were other papers, newspaper clippings, photographs, employment records that showed a man's career systematically destroyed. And before Danny, Elena continued, there was Marcus Webb in '81. Same story. Challenged Bronson, lost impossibly fast, career ended. Marcus is still alive, if you can call it that. He's in a psychiatric facility in Oregon. Keeps talking about how Bronson's draw defied physics. Frank looked up from the papers, his mouth dry. How do you know all this? Elena's smile was bitter. Because Marcus Webb was my father. The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Frank studied her face, seeing the resemblance now. The same sharp features, the same haunted look he'd noticed in one of the photographs. I've been investigating this for 5 years, she said, following the pattern, documenting the victims. Bronson has been destroying careers for over a decade, and nobody's connected the dots because who's going to believe that a Hollywood actor is systematically targeting the fastest guns in the business? Frank sank into his kitchen chair, the envelope's contents scattered across the table. 3 names, 3 ruined lives, 3 men who'd made the same mistake he had. But why? What's he protecting? That's what I need your help to find out. Elena sat across from him, leaning forward intensely. You're the first one who's been close enough to see his fear, Frank. The first one who might have witnessed something the night before. Because there's always something the night before. I just haven't been able to figure out what. The memory came flooding back with perfect clarity, the whispered voices, the woman's silhouette fleeing Bronson's trailer, the fear in the actor's eyes as he scanned the darkness. Frank had been 15 feet away, hidden in shadow, an accidental witness to something that had terrified one of Hollywood's toughest men. Elena was watching his face carefully. You saw something, didn't you? Frank nodded slowly, understanding that his life had just changed irrevocably. Whatever comfortable illusions he'd harbored about his career, his future, his understanding of what had happened yesterday, they were gone. In their place was something far more dangerous, the truth. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I did. Elena leaned back in her chair, but Frank was already shaking his head. The photographs scattered across his kitchen table, suddenly feeling like evidence in a crime he wasn't ready to be part of. No. He stood up abruptly, gathering the papers with trembling hands. I can't do this. I won't. Frank, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. He shoved the documents back into the envelope, not caring that some of the edges crumpled. You think Bronson's some kind of... what? Killer? And you want me to help you prove it based on what shadows I saw in a parking lot? Elena remained seated, watching him pace the small kitchen. 3 men, Frank. 3 careers destroyed. 3 lives ruined. That's not coincidence. It's not murder either. Frank thrust the envelope at her, but she didn't take it. Danny Kowalski was drunk. Your father... He stopped, seeing the pain flash across her face. Look, I'm sorry about your dad, but maybe he really did lose his mind. Maybe we all did. Maybe getting beat just broke something in us. Is that what you really believe? Frank turned away, staring out the window at the pre-dawn darkness. In a few hours, the phone would start ringing. Word would spread. By noon, everyone in Hollywood would know that Lightning Mac Kenzie had lost his edge. I believe I need to salvage what's left of my career, not chase conspiracy theories. There won't be a career to salvage. Elena's voice was quiet, matter-of-fact. That's how this works. Check your messages. Frank's answering machine showed 4 new calls since midnight. His stomach clenched as he pressed play. Frank, it's Jim Castellano. The voice of his agent filled the kitchen, artificially cheerful. Listen, buddy, had to cancel the meeting with Universal tomorrow. Something came up. We'll reschedule soon, okay? The second message was from a director who'd promised Frank work on an upcoming Western. Mac Kenzie, sorry, but we're going in a different direction with the stunt coordination. Nothing personal. The third was a hang-up. The fourth was Tommy Chen again, but his tone had changed from concerned to carefully distant. "Hey Frank, just wanted to let you know, word's getting around that maybe you've been overstating your abilities. Might want to lay low for a while." Frank stared at the machine, his reflection ghost-like in its black plastic surface. It had been less than 12 hours since the contest. 12 hours and his phone was already going silent. "How?" he whispered. "They protect their own." Elena stood up, moving to the window. "Hollywood's a small town, Frank. All it takes is a few phone calls, some whispered conversations. Someone mentions that Lightning Mackenzie isn't what he used to be, that maybe hiring him is a liability. The story spreads, gets embellished. By the end of the week, you'll be known as the has-been who thought he could outdraw Charles Bronson." Frank felt the walls of his apartment closing in. "So what am I supposed to do? Hide? Run? You're supposed to fight back. With what? Theories about mysterious women and impossible draw speeds?" Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Elena, I saw Bronson draw. It was fast, but it wasn't supernatural. Maybe I'm just not as good as I thought." Elena turned from the window, and Frank saw something dangerous in her expression. "Call Mickey Torino." The name hit Frank like a slap. Mickey had been his mentor, the man who'd taught him everything about stunt work and fast draw techniques. They'd had a falling out 2 years ago over a job, something stupid about credit and billing. Frank hadn't spoken to him since. What does Mickey have to do with this? "Just call him. Ask him about Charles Bronson." Elena walked to the door, then paused. "And Frank, when you do call him, notice how long it takes him to hang up." She was gone before Frank could respond, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Frank stood alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the debris of his career, the canceled messages, the bitter taste of fear, the envelope of documents she'd left behind despite his refusal. His hands shook as he dialed Mickey's number from memory. The phone rang once, twice. "Yeah?" Mickey's voice was gravelly with sleep and suspicion. "Mickey, it's Frank. Frank Mackenzie." Silence stretched between them, longer than their history of anger should have warranted. When Mickey finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "Jesus, Frank. What time is it? I need to ask you something about Charles Bronson." The line went dead immediately. Frank stared at the phone, his mentor's fear echoing in the dial tone. Outside his window, Los Angeles was beginning to wake up, but Frank felt like he was sinking deeper into darkness. Elena's envelope lay on his kitchen table like a challenge, and despite every instinct telling him to burn it and forget everything, he found himself reaching for the photographs of broken men who'd made the same mistake he had, the same mistake that was apparently unforgivable. Frank's fingers trembled as he spread Elena's photographs across his kitchen table like tarot cards predicting doom. Danny Kowalski's police report, Marcus Webb's psychiatric evaluation, employment records that told the story of systematic destruction, career after career reduced to ash. His own reflection stared back from the black window, hollow-eyed and gray. In 6 hours, he was supposed to be on set for a television western. The phone call would come, they always came, polite and apologetic, explaining that his services were no longer required. The landline rang, shrill in the pre-dawn silence. "Frank?" Sarah's voice was thick with sleep and something else. "Pity. I just heard. Tommy Chen called me, said you might need—" "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Nobody's fine after—" She paused, and Frank could picture her in her apartment across town, probably sitting up in bed, trying to find words for what she'd witnessed. "What happened yesterday wasn't normal, Frank. The way Bronson drew, it was like he knew exactly when you'd move. Like he'd practiced against you specifically." Frank's blood turned to ice water. "What do you mean?" "I was watching through the telephoto lens, getting coverage shots for the behind-the-scenes reel. Bronson started moving before you did. Not much, maybe a 1/10 of a second, but—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Frank, he knew. Somehow he knew exactly when you'd go for your gun." The phone felt heavy in Frank's hand. Outside, a garbage truck groaned to life in the distance, the mundane sounds of a world continuing its rotation while his own spun apart. "Sarah, I need you to send me that footage." "I can't. Studio property, and besides—" She caught herself too late. Besides, what? They already took it. Security came to the lab this morning, confiscated all the behind-the-scenes material from yesterday, said there were legal concerns about depicting Bronson in an unflattering light. The conspiracy was tightening around him like a noose. Frank stared at the photographs on his table. Danny Kowalski's smashed car, Marcus Webb's vacant stare from a hospital bed, employment records that documented the systematic erasure of careers. Sarah, how long have we been seeing each other? 6 months. Frank, why? In those 6 months, how many people have you told about my routines? About how I practice, when I draw fastest, what my tells are? The silence stretched so long Frank thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. There was this man, about 3 months ago, at that rap party for Silver Canyon. He said he was a journalist writing about stunt coordinators. Very charming, asked a lot of questions about your techniques. I thought it was good publicity. Frank's world tilted sideways. 3 months ago, right when his relationship with Sarah had gotten serious, when she'd started spending nights at his apartment, when she'd watched him practice his draw thousands of times in his living room mirror. What did he look like? Tall, dark hair, expensive suit. He had this watch, really distinctive, silver with a turquoise face. Said his name was... She was crying now, the sound soft and broken. Said his name was Charles. Frank dropped the phone, the handset clattering against the kitchen floor as Sarah's voice called his name from the static. Charles Bronson had been studying him for months, learning his patterns, timing his reflexes, preparing for a contest that Frank had walked into blind. The envelope Elena had left seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Frank pulled out Mickey's employment records, scanning the dates with growing horror. Every time Mickey had worked with Bronson, and there had been 5 films over the past decade, a fast-draw specialist had mysteriously lost a public contest within 6 months. Mickey hadn't just refused to talk about Bronson. Mickey had been feeding him targets. Frank's hands shook as he dialed Mickey's number again. This time, his mentor answered on the first ring, voice alert despite the early hour. I wondered when you'd call back. You son of a bitch. You set me up. Mickey's laugh was hollow, defeated. Set you up? Frank, I tried to warn you. Remember what I always said about picking your battles? How many of us have there been, Mickey? How many careers have you helped him destroy? The silence was answer enough. Frank could picture Mickey in his cluttered workshop, surrounded by the holsters and rigs he'd crafted for Hollywood's greatest westerns, each one a masterpiece that had helped sell the myth of the fast draw. He pays well, Mickey finally whispered. And he knows things, Frank. Things about people that can destroy more than careers. I tried to talk you out of challenging him. Frank hung up, cutting off the excuses. He sat in his kitchen as dawn crept across Los Angeles, understanding finally that his humiliation hadn't been random bad luck or fading skills. It had been an execution, planned and orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. The phone rang again. Frank stared at it, knowing that each call would carry him deeper into a truth that no one was supposed to survive. Frank let the phone ring. Whatever lies or threats waited on the other end could wait. He needed to think. The pieces of Elena's puzzle lay scattered across his table like fragments of shattered glass, each one reflecting a different angle of the same ugly truth. 3 months of preparation. Sarah unknowingly feeding Bronson intelligence about his techniques, his timing, his tells. Mickey serving as some kind of talent scout, identifying targets for systematic destruction. And somewhere behind it all, the secret that Bronson was willing to kill careers to protect. The woman fleeing his trailer, the fear in Bronson's eyes, the whispered conversation Frank had witnessed in the darkness. Frank pulled out Elena's photograph of her father, Marcus Webb, and studied the man's haunted expression. The same look Frank had seen in his own mirror for the past 18 hours. The shell-shocked stare of someone whose reality had been shattered in 0.12 seconds. But Marcus had said Bronson's draw defied physics. Not that it was fast, not that it was skilled, that it was impossible. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Frank ignored it, reaching instead for his own copy of yesterday's shooting schedule. He'd memorized every detail, arrival times, scene requirements, equipment lists. But now he studied it with different eyes, looking for patterns, for preparation. Charles Bronson had arrived on set 2 hours early. Not unusual for a professional, except he'd specifically requested that no other actors be present during his rehearsal time. He'd worked privately with the armorer, insisting on a particular weapon, a Colt .45 with specific modifications to the trigger mechanism. Modifications that Mickey Torino had recommended. Frank's stomach lurched as the final piece clicked into place. It hadn't been superhuman reflexes or impossible speed. It had been simple technology. A rigged weapon that fired at the first twitch of Bronson's finger, maybe even responded to a remote trigger. While Frank had drawn with the honest speed of 20 years' practice, Bronson had cheated with the cold precision of electronic timing. The woman in his trailer hadn't been a lover or a victim. She'd been a technician, someone with the knowledge to wire a gun for remote activation, and Frank had seen her face. The phone rang again, and this time Frank answered without looking at the caller ID. "You figured it out, didn't you?" Elena's voice was tight with urgency. "I can hear it in your breathing. The gun was rigged. Among other things, yes. But Frank, you need to get out of there. Now. I just got word." The line went dead. Frank stared at the handset, then heard the soft sound of footsteps on the external staircase. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with military precision toward his apartment. Through his peephole, Frank saw 3 men in dark suits. The one in front wore a distinctive watch, silver with a turquoise face. The same watch Sarah had described from the rap party 3 months ago. "Mr. Mackenzie?" The voice was cultured, polite, deadly. "We'd like to speak with you about some photographs you've acquired." Frank backed away from the door, his mind racing. Elena's envelope lay open on his kitchen table, evidence scattered like an accusation. The fire escape was blocked. He could hear movement on the metal grating outside his bedroom window. They'd come prepared for every exit. "We know you're there, Frank." The voice carried the patient tone of someone accustomed to compliance. "And we know Elena Vasquez visited you tonight. This doesn't have to be complicated." Frank grabbed the photographs and shoved them inside his jacket, then moved to his gun safe. His hands shook as he spun the combination, not because he intended to fight, but because he needed the psychological comfort of cold steel against his palm. "You have 30 seconds before we come in," the voice announced. "The lock on your door is no impediment to us." Frank looked around his apartment, the modest space that had been his refuge for 2 years, filled with the accumulated debris of a career he'd thought was built on skill and dedication. Now it felt like a mausoleum, a monument to his own naive belief that talent mattered more than power. "Frank?" The voice had changed, become more personal. "I want you to think about Danny Kowalski, about Marcus Webb, about what happens to men who ask too many questions about things they don't understand." "You mean what happens to men who threaten to expose Charles Bronson's secret?" Frank spoke to the door, knowing they could hear him. "The secret that's worth destroying careers, worth rigging contests, worth murder." The silence stretched for exactly 10 seconds. "Then, you're making this very difficult, Frank. Mr. Bronson simply wants to protect his privacy. His medical condition requires discretion. Medical condition." The words hit Frank like a physical blow, reframing everything he thought he understood. Not a criminal conspiracy, something else entirely. Something that explained the fear, the desperation, the willingness to destroy innocent men rather than risk exposure. Charles Bronson wasn't protecting a secret. He was protecting a weakness. Frank's grip tightened on his pistol as the revelation crystallized. A medical condition. Something that would shatter Bronson's image as Hollywood's most dangerous man. The kind of vulnerability that could end not just a career, but an entire mythology built on strength and intimidation. "Parkinson's," Frank whispered to himself, the word falling into place like the final tumbler in a lock. The tremors he'd glimpsed in Bronson's trailer, the woman who wasn't a lover but a nurse, the desperation to maintain an illusion of steady hands and lightning reflexes. "You understand now." The voice beyond his door carried a note of relief. "Mr. Bronson has been fighting this condition for 3 years. In our business, perception is everything. The moment the studios learn that Charles Bronson can't hold a gun steady," Frank's mind raced through the implications. Every action hero faced the same nightmare, the inevitable moment when age or illness revealed them as mortal. But Bronson had found a way to cheat that mortality, to buy time by destroying anyone who might expose his weakness. The technology, Frank said, still speaking to the door. Electromagnetic triggers? Motion sensors? Ingenious, isn't it? A fraction of a second advantage, imperceptible to the naked eye. Just enough to maintain the legend. The speaker's tone had shifted, almost conversational now. Your challenge forced our hand. We couldn't allow the possibility of defeat, not with so much at stake. Frank felt a surge of bitter laughter. All those years believing in his own skill, his own reputation, when he'd been swimming in waters controlled by men with deeper pockets and fewer scruples. How many other contests had been rigged? How many legends were built on electronic lies? Danny Kowalski figured it out, didn't he? Frank moved closer to the door, needing to hear the truth. That's why he died. Danny was a brilliant technician. Unfortunately, he was also an idealist. He believed the public deserved to know the truth about their heroes. A pause. Marcus Webb made similar mistakes. Both men forced us to take protective measures. The casual mention of murder made Frank's blood run cold. These weren't studio executives protecting an investment. They were killers maintaining a conspiracy worth millions. Bronson's image had become too valuable to allow reality to intrude. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message. Elena, back exit, 2 minutes, trust me. Through his apartment, Frank could hear soft scratching at his bedroom window. Not the men in suits, but someone working on the fire escape lock from the outside. Elena had found another way. Frank, we're prepared to be generous. The voice carried new urgency. Mr. Bronson understands your position. A career destroyed, reputation shattered. We can fix that. Better roles, bigger budgets. All we need is your discretion. It was exactly what Frank had dreamed of 18 hours ago. Redemption, the chance to rebuild what he'd lost. But now he understood the true cost. Silence purchased with blood, success built on the graves of honest men who'd asked inconvenient questions. The scratching at his window stopped. 3 soft taps. Elena's signal. Frank made his choice. You want to know what I figured out? He raised his voice, buying time as he moved toward the bedroom. I figured out that Charles Bronson isn't the fastest draw in Hollywood. He's the most terrified. The explosion of splintering wood told him his front door had just died. Frank dove through his bedroom window onto the fire escape, where Elena waited with bolt cutters and a desperate expression. Move, she hissed, already scrambling down the metal stairs. They'll have the building surrounded in 30 seconds. Frank followed, his heart hammering against his ribs as shouts erupted from his apartment above. The photographs in his jacket felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, evidence that could destroy not just Bronson, but the entire machinery of intimidation and murder that protected him. They reached the alley as flashlight beams swept across the windows above. Elena led him to a motorcycle hidden behind a dumpster, its engine already running. Where are we going? Frank swung his leg over the bike, wrapping his arms around Elena's waist as she gunned the engine. Somewhere they can't follow, she shouted over the roar. Somewhere we can turn the tables. As they raced through the pre-dawn streets of Los Angeles, Frank felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, the knowledge that powerful men wanted him dead. But underneath it, growing stronger with each passing block, was something else. Anger. Pure, focused rage at the machine that had crushed Danny Kowalski, broken Marcus Webb, and tried to erase Frank Mackenzie. A system that protected the powerful by destroying the honest, that turned heroes into killers and legends into lies. Behind them, sirens began to wail, but Frank no longer felt like running. He felt like fighting back. Climax. Elena's motorcycle screamed through the industrial maze of downtown Los Angeles as dawn painted the sky the color of old blood. Frank pressed against her back, feeling the photographs crinkle in his jacket, evidence that could topple an empire built on lies. The sirens behind them grew closer, but Elena navigated the narrow alleys between warehouses with the precision of someone who'd planned this route 100 times. There! She pointed to a massive film studio complex rising ahead of them, its gates guarded but its perimeter fence scarred by decades of urban decay. Bronson's shooting the finale of Death Valley today. Full cast, full crew. Too many witnesses for them to silence everyone. Frank understood immediately. Elena wasn't running from the confrontation. She was racing toward it. They abandoned the motorcycle at a hole in the fence, crawling through rusted chain link into the studio backlot. The western town set sprawled before them, false-fronted buildings and dusty streets designed to sell the mythology of the American frontier. How fitting, Frank thought, that the truth would finally surface in a place built entirely on illusion. "My father's footage," Elena gasped as they ran between the sound stages. "I found it yesterday. 3 minutes of raw film he shot the night before his breakdown. It shows everything. The woman with the technical equipment, Bronson's hands shaking, the modified weapons." They reached the edge of the active set as the first assistant director called for quiet. 300 people, actors, crew, studio executives, gathered around a elaborate gunfight sequence. At the center of it all stood Charles Bronson, resplendent in black leather, his face a mask of controlled menace that had launched 1,000 imitators. But Frank saw what others missed: the slight tremor in Bronson's left hand, the way he kept his right hand close to his body, minimizing movement, the nearly invisible wire running from his holster to a small device clipped to his belt. "Cut!" The director's voice boomed across the set. "Charlie," the draw looked a little slow on that take. "Let's try it again," and this time, the draw was perfect. Bronson's voice carried the quiet authority that had silenced 100 film sets. "We'll use that take." Frank stepped into the light. "Actually," he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade, "I think we should talk about draws, fast ones, impossible ones." Every head turned toward him. Frank felt the weight of 300 stares, but his attention focused entirely on Bronson's face. The actor's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, the look of a cornered animal calculating its chances. "Frank Mackenzie," Bronson said, his voice carrying across the set. "I heard about your difficulties yesterday. Perhaps you should speak with someone about managing disappointment." "Oh, I've learned to manage a lot of things." Frank walked closer, aware of security guards moving to intercept him but still talking. "Disappointment, humiliation, the slow realization that everything I believed about skill and honor was carefully orchestrated theater." The security guards reached him, but the director waved them back. Hollywood loved drama, even unscripted confrontations that might become legendary stories. Frank could see cameras still rolling, capturing every moment for posterity. Elena appeared beside him, holding a film canister like a weapon. "Tell them about the modification, Mr. Bronson. Tell them about the electronic trigger system. Tell them about my father." For the first time, Charles Bronson's composure cracked. The tremor in his left hand became visible to everyone on the set, and he quickly shoved it into his jacket pocket. But the damage was done. The myth of steady nerves and lightning reflexes had developed its first visible fissure. "I don't know what fantasies you've constructed," Bronson said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Yesterday's contest was fair and witnessed by people who didn't know what they were seeing." Frank pulled the photographs from his jacket, holding them high enough for the cameras to capture. Marcus Webb figured it out. That's why he's in a mental institution. Danny Kowalski figured it out. That's why he's dead. The set had gone completely silent. 300 people hung on every word, sensing they were witnessing something that would become Hollywood legend. The moment a manufactured god was revealed to have clay feet. Bronson's right hand moved toward his holster with desperate instinct, but Frank was ready. This time, he knew what to look for: the subtle activation of the electronic system, the artificial advantage that had destroyed so many careers. Frank drew first, clean, honest, with the pure speed of 20 years' dedication to his craft. His weapon cleared leather and leveled at Bronson before the actor's rigged gun could complete its electronic-assisted draw. 0.08 seconds, Frank announced to the silent set. "That's what an honest draw looks like." Charles Bronson stood frozen, his weapon half-drawn, his secret finally exposed before an audience of hundreds. The tremor had spread to both hands now, the stress of exposure overwhelming the medication that had hidden his condition. "You've destroyed me," Bronson whispered, but his voice carried no anger, only the exhausted relief of a man who'd finally stopped running from the truth. Frank lowered his weapon. "No, Charlie, you destroyed yourself. The rest of us just cleaned up the wreckage." The silence stretched across the set like a held breath before shattering into chaos. Studio executives screamed into phones, lawyers materialized from shadows, and 3 camera crews scrambled to capture every angle of Hollywood's newest disaster. But Frank found himself watching Charles Bronson, who stood motionless in the center of the maelstrom, his rigged weapon finally holstered, his hands shaking openly now that the pretense was over. 30 years, Bronson said, his voice barely audible above the surrounding pandemonium. 30 years of fighting this goddamn disease, and you've ended it in 30 seconds. Frank felt no triumph, only a hollow sadness for what they'd all lost, the innocent belief that legends were built on merit rather than machinery. You ended it yourself the night you chose fear over honesty. Elena stepped forward, her father's film canister clutched against her chest like a talisman. My father spent 15 years in that institution because he tried to tell the truth. 15 years believing he was crazy. Bronson's laugh was bitter as desert wind. Your father was the bravest man on any set I ever worked. That's why he had to be stopped. The admission hung in the air as security guards finally reached them, but their hesitation was palpable. How do you arrest a man for exposing a lie? How do you silence a truth that 300 witnesses had just observed? Frank surrendered his weapon without resistance, but kept his eyes on Bronson. What happens now, Charlie? Now? Bronson removed his own gun belt, letting it fall to the dusty ground of the artificial western town. Now I go home and learn to live with shaking hands and honest mirrors. 6 months later, Frank sat in his new apartment overlooking Tucson's mountain ranges, reading the final article in what the entertainment press had dubbed the Bronson Revelations. 3 congressional hearings, 17 criminal indictments, and 46 civil lawsuits had dismantled the network of technicians, executives, and enforcers who'd maintained the conspiracy. Marcus Webb was receiving proper medical care. Elena's father had been transferred to a real hospital, his memories finally validated by external truth. Charles Bronson had disappeared entirely from public view. Frank's phone rang, not the desperate urgency of that night in Los Angeles, but the gentle chime of an ordinary day. Elena's voice carried the peace of someone who'd finally laid her ghosts to rest. The documentary premieres tonight, she said. Are you watching? Frank looked at his television, still dark, still silent. He'd avoided all media coverage of the story, preferring the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth existed without needing to revisit its painful excavation. I lived it. That's enough. My father asked me to thank you again. He's painting now. Landscapes, portraits, beautiful things. His hands are steady when he holds a brush. Through his window, Frank could see teenagers practicing quick-draw techniques in the park below, their movements honest and unaugmented by technology. One of them, a girl with her grandmother's determined expression, had achieved remarkable speed through nothing but practice and dedication. Yesterday, she'd asked Frank to time her draw. 0.15 seconds. Pure talent. Elena? Frank said, watching the girl holster her weapon with satisfied pride. Do you think we did the right thing? I think we told the truth. Whether that's right or wrong isn't our decision anymore. After she hung up, Frank remained at his window as darkness settled over Tucson. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, wild, honest, unashamed of its nature. Frank had spent 2 years in this desert learning to be honest again, remembering who he was before Hollywood taught him to measure worth by other people's approval. His own gun hung in a simple holster by the door, clean and unmodified. He practiced daily, not to reclaim old glory, but to maintain connection with the craft that had defined his younger self. His current best time was 0.12 seconds, slower than his prime, but achieved through 30 years of accumulated skill rather than electronic assistance. Some evenings, when the wind carried distant sounds across the desert, Frank thought he heard the echo of that last confrontation. Bronson's whispered relief, Elena's vindicated tears, the mechanical whir of cameras preserving the moment when artificial legends surrendered to authentic truth. But mostly he heard silence, and in that silence, something approaching peace. The girl in the park had packed up her equipment, but Frank could see her through his kitchen window, walking home with the confident stride of someone who'd earned her skill honestly. Tomorrow she'd return, and her draw would be a fraction faster, not through technological enhancement, but through the ancient alchemy of practice, dedication, and time. Frank smiled, understanding finally that some stories end not with triumph but with the quiet satisfaction of truth acknowledged, wreckage cleared, and honest hands free to build something real from whatever remained. In the distance, the coyote called again, and this time Frank heard an answer.